Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Brewers Minute. So, a few weeks ago, we had a Brewers Minute where we talked about sideboarding in Modern, specifically the most played sideboard cards in the format. And in that Brewers Minute, our focus was mostly on reactive sideboarding. And by reactive, I mean you see your opponents playing Affinity, so you bring in Stony Silence. You see your opponents playing Dredge, so you bring in Rest in Peace or Relic of Progenitus. Basically, sideboarding after you know what your opponent's doing to try to disrupt their game plan. And while that is very important kind of level 1 sideboarding in Modern, there is a next level, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and that is proactive sideboarding. And by this I mean when you are playing Affinity and you're playing against a white deck, and you think your opponent most likely is going to bring in Stony Silence, because Stony Silence is one of the most played cards in the entire Modern format, or you're playing Dredge, and you know your opponent's playing Rest in Peace or Relic of Progenitus. What do? You can't just sit there and be like, okay, our opponent's going to bring in a card that absolutely wrecks my deck. I cannot beat that card, but we'll just hope they don't draw it. That's not a legitimate plan. So when you're playing a deck that has a hard time beating a sideboard card, you want to proactively, even if you're not 100% sure, you kind of make an educated guess and deduct that, well, Stony Silence is super heavily played, my opponent's in white, they're probably going to have it, I probably should prepare for that, and you bring in cards specifically to interact with that card, so you kind of go to the next level there. So that's our topic for today, and we're going to go through a few popular Modern lists that can really struggle with sideboard cards, and talk about some common cards that you can proactively bring in from your sideboard to deal with the hate cards that you are expecting your opponent to bring in. So a quick reminder before we break down proactive sideboarding in Modern. If you enjoy Brewers Minute and the other series here on the channel, it would be amazing of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's start with Affinity, because Affinity is top tier in Modern at the moment, one of the most played decks in the entire format, and the deck really struggles with Stony Silence. That is kind of the nightmare for Affinity. Yes, just normal artifact disruption is fine, but Stony Silence just locks down the deck so hard. That's the card that Affinity wants to be. So let's say you're playing Affinity. What cards do Affinity decks play in the sideboard to proactively bring in and fight against Stony Silence? And there's actually a few different options. Some of the most popular ones are Thoughtseize, which lets you even more proactively, hopefully on turn 1, take a Stony Silence from your opponent's hand. Spell Pierce lets you counter a Stony Silence. Abrupt Decay, Wear Tear can kill a Stony Silence from the battlefield. So those are some of the most popular options you see, and you'll notice, and this will be a theme going through our video today, is all of those cards are multi-purpose. You can use Thoughtseize and Spell Pierce to deal with a sweeper. If your opponent has Anger of the Gods, another very good card. So while you're primarily or mostly interested in making sure you don't lose to Stony Silence, you still get some extra value out of these cards. So you're not bringing in, I don't know, Erase, 1 mana destroying enchantment, because that's a very narrow card and it only has applications in one situation. So you're looking for cards that are not only going to save you from Stony Silence in a very efficient manner, but cards that also can apply. Maybe you bring in Thoughtseize against a deck with Wrath, for example, or so on and so forth. So aim wide as you're choosing those cards, but these are cards that you're going to want to bring in if your opponent's playing a white deck. As simple as that. If your opponent has white in their deck, you automatically assume they're on Stony Silence, because essentially every white deck in Modern is going to play Stony Silence. I'm sure there's exceptions, but a very, very high percentage of decks are going to have it. So bring in those cards proactively. Another example, sticking with Stony Silence, is Lantern Control, and we can see the same trend, but with different cards. So Lantern Control is going to play stuff like Seal of Primordium, Maelstrom Pulse, Nature's Claim. Those are all efficient ways to get a Stony Silence off the battlefield. Seal of Primordium in specific is really unique because it works really well with the plan of the deck. You want to be playing Ensnaring Bridge and being empty-handed so your opponent can't attack you. So Seal of Primordium, you can just let sit out on the battlefield, and even if your opponent draws a Stony Silence later in the game, you can still kill it while also remaining empty-handed to prevent yourself from dying to creatures with Ensnaring Bridge. So let's move on to Dredge, and the nightmare for Dredge is Graveyard Hate. Mostly Rest in Peace is probably the most impactful, but also Relic of Progenitus can show up, Leyline of the Void. But let's stick with Rest in Peace. That's another card, if your opponent's playing white, they almost always will have Rest in Peace in their deck. If they're playing graveyard synergies of their own, it might be another graveyard hate spell, but for the most part, it's pretty safe to assume that your opponent has it. So what does Dredge bring in? Well, you have Abrupt Decays, Nature's Claims, Thought Seizes, and you're probably starting to see a trend there, and these are some of the best catch-alls. So you're playing Dredge, Abrupt Decay can also get rid of an Ensnaring Bridge that is keeping you from beating down with your creatures you got back from the graveyard. Thought Seize can also take the Anger of Gods. It's gonna kill all of your board and exile your creatures so you can't get them back again. So aim wide. Let's move on to Storm is another great example. So Storm really struggles with Eidolon of Rhetoric, Rule of Law, basically effects that say you can only cast one card each turn. And so far we've talked about decks that are kind of in the green-black space. Affinity can play any color thanks to Glimmer Voids and stuff. Storm is a little different because it's blue-red. So what cards does Storm bring in to deal with enchantments like Rule of Law, which is kind of a bad card type for a lot of blue-red decks. They don't interact with that naturally. So some of the most common ones are bounce spells like Echoing Truth and Wipe Away. So these, again, are catch-alls. You can get rid of the Eidolon of Rhetoric or Rule of Law that's keeping you from going off. You can also bounce a Leyline of Sanctity, for example, that's keeping you from targeting your opponent with a Grape Shot to the face to kill your opponent. Negate is another one, kind of a catch-all. You can counter a Planeswalker, you can counter a discard spell, you can also counter that annoying Rule of Law. It doesn't work as well with Eidolon, but one counter spell that's kind of a catch-all and great in the Storm deck is Swan Song that does hits enchantments, and it hits a lot of other types as well, so you can use it to force through your combo against counterspell decks where your opponent's going to try to counter your ritual, also keep the Rule of Law off the table for just 1 mana. The point of all this is, there's a couple of different ways for sideboarding. On level 1, you sideboard to interact with what your opponent's doing. You bring in the Stony Silence to stop your opponent from killing you with affinity creatures, or to lock down your opponent's Lantern Control deck from milling you out. So that's level 1, that's very important, but the next level is learning to think, well, what's my opponent going to sideboard in against me? And even though you're taking some educated guesses, and you probably don't know 100%, bringing in cards to specifically interact with your opponent's cards coming in from the sideboard. And that's really, really important, especially if you're playing decks that really struggle with a specific sideboard card, and even more if it's a popular sideboard card like the ones we've been talking about today. So if your deck struggles with Stony Silence, or Rest in Peace, or Rule of Law, or Leyline of Sanctity, you want to have a plan for that and err on the side of bringing in your Abrupt Decays, or your Seal of Primordiums, or your Swan Songs, or Echoing Truths, because there's nothing worse than playing Storm and feeling like you got a great hand, and then your opponent slams down the Rule of Law, and you realize, oh my god, I didn't expect that, I didn't bring in my Echoing Truth. So these are cards that you should just almost always bring in as a safety net, as a catch-all, just in case. It's better to have a somewhat dead Echoing Truth in your hand than to find out your opponent snuck a Rule of Law in and you literally just scoop up the game to a 3-mana sideboard card. So err on the side of bringing these cards in, even when you're not 100% certain, because you're going to win more games having one dead card that you may or may not even draw in your deck than just scooping to a popular sideboard card. So anyway, that's our Brewers Minute for this week. Proactive sideboarding for Modern. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.